Right, hello everyone. So this is kind of a sequel to my video on Dragons Rising Season 2 Part 1, which worked rather well as its own thing, because the most recent thing we had gotten from Ninjago at that point was the latter half of that same season, except with this review we've had the first half of Season 3 released officially onto Netflix, and then most of the second half leaked a week later. So during this review I'm going to try and talk about this part of Dragons Rising without taking into account what happens in Season 3, because I didn't have the context of the following season for the part 1 review, and it would just make this review feel a little bit disjointed and awkward if what came afterwards in season 3 was talked about and referenced constantly. With that out of the way, let's get into the review. The first half of Dragons Rising Season 2 was pretty damn near perfect in my opinion. The only slightly negative things that I have to say about it pertain to the side plot being a little bit too long in some places, but that's it. That is the only criticism I have pertaining to the first half of the season. I have absolutely no problems with how the characters or plot were handled, so obviously I was very excited about the second half of this season, but also a little bit worried because they had possibly set themselves up for failure by having such a strong first half, and then having the second half focus on yet another tournament. One of the biggest things this part had to do was differentiate the Tournament of Sorcerers from the Tournament of Elements, which is one of the most praised Ninjago seasons, and because of this, the idea of a second tournament was a bit worrying to me, because there was a very high chance of it feeling like a repeat of a story Ninjago's already told, but they absolutely blew the old tournament out of the water with this new one. A bit like the Tournament of Elements, this part has more than just the tournament going on, because it's accompanied by a murder mystery plotline, making for a really great and tense tournament story. While the Tournament of Elements also had mystery elements to it, I feel like they answer a lot of the questions they present a little bit too quickly, because we learned in episode 1 that Chen does in fact have Zane in his basement, so we know he isn't lying about that, and I'm pretty sure we learned that Skylar's a double agent in the same episode. The idea of there being a spy among the elemental masters is introduced, so while it's cool to see the characters figure out the truth behind these mysteries we have the answers to, I think it's far more compelling if we, the viewer, are also asking ourselves the same questions as them, and it especially works with a murder mystery story they're trying to tell where we're not sure who to trust, and the show gives us a lot of questions to consider alongside the murder of a matriarch, like what the horns are being used for, the link to the games being rigged, and what Raz is ultimately planning, making for a really engaging and interesting tournament story. Us having so much to consider surrounding the murder of a matriarch is brilliant, because the somewhat obvious answer is that Raz killed the matriarch, potentially tying back to what he said all the way back in Season 1 Episode 2 about Lloyd having a connection with Wong before leaving. The twist that Rox and Noct were behind the murder of a matriarch was a genuine surprise to me, because it really subverted the pure evil villain who just wants to destroy trope they usually have in Ninjago, and it was a really good way of building up the five as more than just brutes, especially since they did all this behind Raz's back, who notoriously is quite smart. On its own, this wouldn't have been too interesting of a twist, but the season does so much to build questions around the murder mystery plotline. We need to consider who's rigging the games, why Zeatrix was sidelined, and what the crowns are being used for. All of these questions are answered by Blecht rigging the tournament in favour of Raz's team, and Noct and Rox wanting to free the rest of the five, but I really like that they present us with different possible answers to consider throughout the tournament. The one issue that I can definitely point to for this plotline is the setup, because in theory, them coming across a dying matriarch and finding a map to the City of Temples is pretty perfect setup for this story. But my problems with it start to arise when the Source Dragon of Motion gives them the heading to the City of Temples. I don't think it's bad by any means, but it is a little bit jarring that she can't just look down and see who did it when the Source Dragons can apparently see the past, present, and the possible futures. Her going to the ninja and pointing them to the tournament does make sense, but I think they should have made it a bit more clear that the council was either deadlocked about helping mortals, meaning that she couldn't see who did it, or explain that something external was interfering with her powers. I don't think it's some egregious plot hole, but it's a bit of a weird move, especially when Motion is consistently the one who wants to help mortals, so it's a bit weird that she didn't go rogue and just look down herself. Despite this weird little inconsistency, the murder mystery plotline is really well presented and feels very well fleshed out with how multifaceted it is. But that's only one half of the plot, because there's also the tournament half of it, and this was also really well handled in my opinion. While some of the matches during the tournament are written very weirdly, and some of them are definitely a lot worse than others, the game aspect of it was a lot of fun, and the gimmick of the loser's powers going to the victor feels like such a no-brainer move, and it makes the Tournament of Elements feel a lot less dynamic in comparison to this one, whose stakes only feel like they get higher and higher as the games go on. The power changing gimmick makes the fights feel so much more impressive as they go on, with some really cool and creative power usage throughout the tournament. By the end, there are so many elemental powers being thrown around by just two people, and it's absolutely awesome to watch unfold. Also, the games being a legitimate event instead of an organised sham is also a very nice change of pace, and the lore of it is great. Tying it to the Source Dragon lore we already have is a brilliant move, and making Chen's tournament the cheap knockoff of this one is simultaneously hilarious and a brilliant way to tie the two together. Though I will say, limiting the tournament to just elemental fighters does feel like a massive missed opportunity to me. While I really like what we did get for the tournament, I was also really looking forward to seeing characters like Raz or Jordana compete, and I think it ties into a larger issue of fighters in the merged realms being not much more than the elemental powers they have. But I think this is a larger topic for another time, so I'll spare you all the tangent, but do know that I think it would have been more interesting if they opened the tournament to non-elemental fighters along with the elemental ones. And it's really disappointing since they could have tied it into Roby wanting to be more progressive with the game's post-merge and going against the tradition that Bleck so desperately wants to preserve. What we got is still great though, and a lot of the matches we see have some stunning visuals and some amazing camera work. And even the ones that aren't so good are still a really fun time, but those are more down to the characters being portrayed poorly, so I'll talk about this a bit more in a little bit. With my thoughts of more plot related stuff out of the way, I do want to talk about the villains the tournament gives us, starting off with Bleck, and I'm not sure if this is a controversial take or not within the larger community, but I think he's a really solid villain for the show. Raz has shown us that he goes for vulnerable and weak people, and that is a perfect description of Bleck, because what kind of psycho wants to kill his own nephew to preserve the Squid Games of gods that don't even care about his existence? He's such a pathetic man-child that I can't help but really like his existence as another victim of Raz's manipulation, and I think his dynamic with Roby is a lot of fun since it's just Bleck waffling on about the sanctity of the games before Roby donks on him with another okay boomer line. Bleck baby raging over the tradition of the Source Dragons is especially funny when the Source Dragon of Motion quite literally came down from the heavens and told the ninja to win the games Bleck was so desperately trying to make them lose. He just totally loses himself in his pathetic desire to keep tradition going, and he absolutely deserves what he got at the end of the season with how deeply evil he is with wanting to murder his own teenage nephew. Bleck is a really solid antagonist, all things considered, and I do really hope we see him again, because there's still a lot more they could do with this guy if they wanted to. And speaking of bringing characters back, I would really love if they brought back Cinder in the future, because I really loved this guy in the first half of the season, but did they like lobotomize him after the Blood Moon? Cinder is very obviously a very insecure individual who's felt powerless with how much he flaunts his Shatterspin and elemental powers in front of weaker opponents. And you're telling me they don't capitalize on this during the tournament focused on elemental powers like at all? They could have easily given us some backstory on why Cinder joined Raz and he acts the way he does, and it easily could have tied into Arin and his own insecurities, really leading into a Raz vs Lloyd and Jordana vs Sora parallels they had going on this season. And it's such a shame when Cinder was a really goddamn cool villain in part 1, but they just didn't give us any backstory defining character moments for him after the Blood Moon. Cinder was a massive letdown in this tournament, and I do think that while the villain side of this tournament is really strong, the Wolf Clan dynamics being completely ditched is a real shame because Jordana also suffers from this. While she was far more tastefully handled than Cinder and ties fantastically into Sora's story, it is a real shame they didn't do more with Rox possessing her. Because admittedly, I would have liked to know if this affected the rivalry Cinder had with Jordana in any way. Because did he just stop beefing with her after the Blood Moon? Did he continue only to get no reaction? It would have been nice if we got a small answer to these questions, because while I do infer that Cinder just continued to pester her and stopped after Rox gave him no reaction, getting a scene or two where this is expanded upon would have gone a long way to continue the momentum they had going with the Wolf Clan dynamics into part 2. But despite this, I do like how they handled Jordana's possession of a whole, because it really feeds into how invisible she is to others, with almost no one noticing what's up with her aside from Sora, and this especially says a lot that Raz didn't notice anything odd about her, adding to the question of whether he really cares about his students or not, because he goes out of his way to get Arin on his side, yet he doesn't notice one of his disciples being taken over by an ancient spirit. Putting a pin in that briefly though, I really like that she goes to Sora for help because she's really the only person that she knows who could maybe help her with what she's going through, and realistically, if Raz knew about this, he probably would have killed her immediately upon finding out she was under Rox's influence and conspiring with Noct to take him out. Most of what I have to say about this plot thread is about how Sora was handled here though, so I'll talk about this again later on, but I will take this opportunity to speak about how the Forbidden Five were handled here, because despite some, well, mishaps in how they were written in Season 3, I really like how they were handled here, and I have a whole video where I go into detail on my thoughts on Noct. I'll leave a link to that in the description, but I really love how compelling they were here despite being another pure evil Ninjago faction. I really like Noct in particular here, because while he does have a bunch of moments where it's just hype moments and aura for him and he's an absolute beast in battle, he has a personality alongside that where he's a smug asshole to everyone around him. And having Noct and Rox be the men behind the slaughter is a really great way to set up the Five as more than just fighting machines, because it means they can actually think and pull off an intelligent plan behind Raz's back. While Rox doesn't have nearly as much personality as Noct, or hell, even what we got of Zarked in these episodes, she ties into the many mysteries of the tournament really nicely, and again, it's very cool that she was plotting all of this behind Raz's back. I really like what they did with Forbidden 5 during these episodes, and it's a really fun take on pure evil villains who want nothing more than to conquer and destroy everything, so I really hope that Season 3 doesn't completely fumble them. Despite how much I do enjoy the 5 here though pre-Season 3, I do think that Noct suffers from some rather wonky writing during some of his fights, because him getting pressed by 1 HP Lloyd and losing a match to Sora without the rigging is very silly, and I would have liked for his presentation to be a little bit more consistent. And it does mess with the setup of the 5 a little bit, especially since Noct is supposed to be the strongest of the 5. I don't think it's a deal breaker by any means, but considering they're supposed to be some of the most dangerous warriors to have ever lived, and some of the most powerful fighters of the merged lands, the strongest of them being beaten to the ground by a tech bee is a bit silly in my opinion. And while we're on the topic, choosing to have their strongest fighter be the one to compete in the tournament is not a very good choice, like at all. If you want to have a fighting competition that gasses up these guys as a threat, surely you would want to have your weakest member be our first, and have them still beat the competition, really showing how much of a threat these guys are to the world as a group. Having your strongest almost lose fights that should be incredibly easy be your first showing of these guys is not a good choice by any means, and really doesn't bode well for the rest of the group. That aside, the Forbidden 5 were handled really well in this part, and I love their introduction, and Noct especially is great. He's a perfect balance between being a cocky douchebag and a pure evil villain who wants to kill everyone, and he was a lot of fun here. I really like Noct in the tournament. The final and best villain we have this part is Raz, and this is where he really cements himself as Ninjago's best villain in my opinion, because his dynamic with Arin is absolutely fantastic throughout the season, but it's at its absolute peak here. Obviously I go far more in depth in the dedicated Arin video I made a couple of months ago now, so a link to that will be in the description, but they really lean into Raz's manipulative side during this tournament arc, and they spend a lot of the second half elaborating on what strength is, as opposed to the first half of the season which was all about motion, continuing the amazing dichotomy they have between these two ideas going throughout the season. A large part of Raz's strength ideology involves taking what you need from the world, instead of waiting for it to harmonise with what you want, and this idea being used to pry Arin away from the ninja is genius. Pretty much all of Arin's conflicts at the minute involve time. He's worried about not progressing fast enough and keeping up with the rest of the ninja, and the ninja keep putting off finding his parents. So obviously the strength ideology presenting a solution to both of these is obviously going to appeal to him. This was also the perfect time to have Arin and Raz interact in depth, because they had interacted briefly during the Blood Moon, planting the seeds in Arin's mind that Raz could be his future master, but by the time they finally meet again and talk about Arin's issues in depth, Arin's mental state has gotten noticeably worse, with him not even viewing saving the world over finding his parents to be worth it at this point, and during this time, Raz has gathered enough information about Arin to turn him to his side, so the tournaments of sorcerers rolling around are not only putting them in a situation where they can't fight each other, but also coming in the way of Arin's goals of finding his parents and being a better ninja because he also has to focus on detective work is absolutely perfect in my opinion. The Arin detective stuff is also brilliant. It gives him something to do while the ninja compete in the tournament, and forces him to interact with everybody to solve the mystery of the matriarch's murder, which ties back to the idea of taking what you need from the world, because as the tournament progresses, Arin starts only talking to people when they can be useful to him in solving the murder of the matriarch. I also think it's really interesting how he isn't the one to ultimately solve and expose the people behind the murders, and instead Wildfire is the one who does it. Obviously this is because he's busy following other leads, but it's clear that whenever he harmonizes with the motion of the world, which I'd consider following leads to be a part of, he ends up being overshadowed by someone else. Focusing a bit more on his interactions with Raz though, a core part of them hinges on Raz actually having truth behind his words. Everything he tells Arin, such as Sora faking his object spinjitzu, Lloyd not finding his parents and failing him as a master, along with the earth-shattering discovery that Wu caused the merge, is something that Arin learns about through Raz and later confirms through other sources that us, the viewer, and Arin himself find reliable and can trust. And when it can't be proven through another source, it's empirically proven by Arin himself, when he finally learns proper spinjitzu for example. All of this leads to Raz saying he knows where Arin's parents are, and obviously Arin believes him when everything else has been truthful, ultimately leaving the ninja for Raz, making perfect sense at the end, especially with Raz seemingly being a lot more sympathetic to Arin's plight than any of the ninja have been the past few episodes. And I think it's really interesting how they seemingly answer the part 1 question of does Raz really care about his students with a solid yes. I really don't see any world where Raz goes through all of his effort to get Arin on his side, give him so much information of what he's planning to do if he didn't care about him in the slightest. While I haven't forgotten the scene where Raz describes his words as poison with ill intentions to split up the ninja, I do think that he has to care a little bit, especially when realistically he didn't need Arin for any part of his plan at this point in time, and while this did end up paying off massively when he got stranded in the First Lands in episode 20, Raz would not have needed Arin out of the Cauldron of Realms to complete his master's will. All of this is to say that the dynamic these two have pushed them into some really fascinating places, and I don't think this is just the best character work in all of the tournament, or all of the best character work in Dragons Rising, but I think it's some of the best character work in all of Ninjago as a franchise. It is some absolutely fantastic stuff, and I will eternally love this chapter of Dragons Rising, if not just for Raz and Arin. Moving on from them though, it's time to talk about some of the other characters and Ninja, because while not as brilliant as Arin or Raz, there is some really amazing stuff in here, especially with Sora. Something that I haven't really seen talked about with Sora in the larger community is the fact that she kinda has the best situation out of anyone of the Ninja team post-merge. I don't say this to diminish what she went through Imperium at all, because it was awful and we see the after effects of her time there consistently throughout the first season of the show, but in the post-merge world Dragons Rising takes place in, she's one of the most skilled elemental masters of the merged lands and pretty much has only benefited from the merge, what with her escaping her abusive homeland, forging a new family, and getting elemental powers. Again, this isn't a problem I have with her character at all, because it makes her really interesting in comparison with Arin, who lost almost everything with the merge, and I think the Tournament of Sorcerers capitalizes on this idea in a really interesting way. She's put in a situation where she has to reckon with the fact that not everyone has had that great of a time since the merge, and this is done through her actually having to acknowledge Jordana and recognize her own faults in accidentally pushing her down the path by not remembering her or acknowledging her, and seeing her feel guilty about this is especially powerful when Jordana is way over her head, what with being possessed by one of the most evil elemental masters to ever live. This, along with her and Arin getting more and more distance, is some great setup for an arc about Sora being a better friend to those around her, and obviously we do know how this ended up going in season 3, but I'm really looking forward to seeing how this arc continues in the future, and I really want to see how it ends up going with Jordana in particular, because her and Sora have a really great dynamic here, and I would absolutely love to see more of it in the future, and they definitely seem to be setting it up by asking the question of where she could have disappeared to in episode 20. The way they set this up with Arin is great too, because one of the earliest steps she takes to being a better friend is acknowledging the fact that Arin most likely left with Raz on his own accord and that he might not want to be found by the ninja, as opposed to Lloyd, who immediately assumes that they took Arin. Her story is really interesting and another great part of the tournament, continuing to build off of a fantastic base that Dragons Rising Season 1 laid down for her. A new character that they introduce in this part is Frack, and I'm a big fan of him. He's a really solid parallel of Arin in the sense that they're pretty much the same personality wise. However, whereas Arin started off his journey with learning about motioning and training under Lloyd without a power, Frack has done the complete opposite and started off with strength being taught by Raz. He and Arin have completely opposing paths, what with them both switching sides by the end of the tournament, and I think it's a really interesting look into what Arin could have become had someone like Raz found him after the merge. And if anything, it shows that Arin wouldn't have been a worse person no matter who trained him after the merge, solidifying that his core values are his real strength. It's really just the nature versus nurture debate, what with Frack being an inherently good person despite his master being evil, meaning that the same will hold true for Arin under Raz, and I do hope that they use this to push Frack and Arin's characters forward in the future, because they absolutely could capitalize on this if they want to tell a story about the importance of masters informing and teaching a person. And with Frack being on the ninja team, it's absolutely possible to do more with Arin and Frack interaction in the future, so I really hope they take this route with them. As for the final of the new ninja that actually has a story to tell here, but we'll get to that in a minute, we need to talk about Wildfire, and this may be a controversial take within the large community from what I've seen, but I really like what they did with her here. I get that people were excited to see her try and take on Kai's mantle and were frustrated when she spends a good amount of this part on Roby related hijinks, but I think it works far better with the story that they're telling with her, and the one they're telling with the tournament especially. It gives the team a character who would defend Roby no matter what, making the mystery plot a lot more enticing, and Kai just isn't dead for starters. Granted, he was banished to the Nether Space and may never be seen again, but let's be honest, we all knew that he was going to come back eventually, and what we got of Wildfire missing Kai and wanting to continue his legacy was great and ties into her overarching story of learning to handle her emotions nicely. And if they had played Kai being gone forever completely straight with no Roby subplot, this part would have just ended up being a bunch of melodramatic Wildfire brooding where she still doesn't take up the mantle because Kai comes back in episode 20 anyways, and it's not like her character is completely overwritten by Roby either, because she still does try and avenge Kai and still has to deal with the emotions that come with it, but gets eliminated from the tournament because she got too caught up in avenging him and not trying to win the games and stay in the tournament. The Roby stuff isn't even completely pointless either, because her having a crush on what is essentially a normal teenage dude isn't something she would have done at all in season 1, and it's a good way to show how far she's come and how much more accustomed she is to living with other people. I'm really glad we got to have a more light-hearted Wildfire story instead of it just being comprised of her missing Kai, because it would have been a real shame to spend a bunch of time with that plotline when he just comes back in episode 20 anyways. And while I'm throwing controversial takes around, I think the Dragon Ivory stuff they did for Kai's return really works. I obviously won't be doing a full breakdown of why and how it works within this video because I think it's pretty evident within the show itself and I don't particularly want to have a whole tangent about it, but I'm really glad they built up Kai returning from MC Escher Hell, making it feel earned and well executed, though I do think this plotline does fall short in some other ways. While I love Zark's line about brutal dominance, it would have been really cool if some of the time from this plotline was used to build up and expand upon the members trapped within the Nether space, being Zarx, Kerr and Drix. I don't think it's a massive miss by any means, because in theory, Season 3 should be what develops these guys as a threat, but I think getting some build up to who they are as people within the Nether space would have been really cool to see and would have added a lot to the fear factor we're probably supposed to feel when we cut to Kai in the Nether space. Nonetheless, Kai's eventual return was really cool, and his short fight against Nox is one of the best this season has to offer. Also, quick side note, Kai does not land a single hit against Nox this fight aside from like his Rising Dragon Blast. Kai Glazers will be in shambles upon learning this fact, and all the Kai haters will be rejoicing. Another ninja I feel like they could have done a little bit more with is Cole. While I get that the cast for the tournament was extremely large and not every character is going to get a lot of spotlight, I do think that Cole is left a little bit to the wayside compared to the other characters, but that isn't to say he's bad by any means. He does have his moments here and there, and his dynamic with Thrak is a lot of fun to watch, and it's great to see him start to slip into being a teacher for him. But I do think they could have and probably should have done a lot more with him and Gio's relationship. This is the first part of Dragon's Rising where the two are consistently within proximity of each other, and it's not like Cole isn't present throughout the tournament and going on some side quests, so this would have been a perfect time for us to learn a bit more about Gio as a guy and develop their relationship with Cole. It's a small thing, but I think something that's very emblematic of this issue is the fact that we don't get a single conversation between them about Bonzel being gone. Obviously it doesn't have to be a constant thing because she was obviously going to come back, but getting no acknowledgement after Rising Ninja is a bit of a letdown for me. On the whole, I do think what they did with Cole here is really good, and he keeps getting a lot of great writing, but I do think he does suffer from the ninja team being a bit too bloated for the second half of this season. But nonetheless, he has some really good moments with Thrak. I just would have liked to see a lot more from him and Gio's dynamic and relationship here, because they are not a very developed relationship at the minute, and I really would have liked to see that changed in the second half of this season. Zane is another character who's in this part, and yeah, that's about it. I don't think this part did anything all too good for Zane, which is unfortunately the case with most DR parts, and it's very unfortunate that he spends so much of the tournament being a spectator and doing not much else, with the one time he does contribute anything substantial being the terrible combo vehicle race. This race absolutely sucks unfortunately and makes absolutely no sense within the tournament. It's so pointless that I genuinely forgot about its existence until I had to think about what Zane contributed to the plot for this review, which I also almost forgot to include in and of itself. Really goes to show how much both of these things just absolutely suck. The one saving grace of this combo vehicle race is the fact that it gets the ninja away from Arin so that he can have a substantial conversation with Raz, but that really isn't enough to save us from being an absolute slog to watch. It's not just a low point of the tournament of sources for me, but of Dragon's Rising as a show. This being the only major thing that Zane contributed during the tournament is a massive shame, and I would have liked to see him do a bit more, though I really don't think they should have gone after Jay when Raz sent him away. I've seen this point be made quite a lot since the tournament release, but like, Zane could not have gone after Jay when he left, because Jay had already left and he was gone, he wasn't there. Zane probably wouldn't have been able to track him down, and even then, what would he even do when he found him? The tournament was also just a very all hands on deck situation for the ninja, and sending one of their own after Jay would have been a very bad move on their part. Zane also drops the word cringe during this tournament, and like, man, this really does suck. Zane's dialogue being so robotic really does not help this one at all, and while him saying the word cringe isn't some damning thing for his character realistically, it's really representative of the larger issues that Zane has, and it really brings a lot of them to the forefront. Overall, Zane is just very nothing and lackluster like all of Dragon's Rising in this part, and while he isn't offensively bad for the most part, it's still a real shame that even in one of Ninjago's best installments, he still kinda sucks as a character. A member of the original four who didn't suck in the tournament is Jay though, because I absolutely adore what they did with him here. Obviously his fight with Nya is bogged down a bit by the exposition heavy dialogue, which is very janky at times, but the story they actually tell with him is some really great stuff, and it's an amazing setup for the future of Jay's stories. The dialogue is very whack though, with amazing lines such as "Are you a terrible ninja?" standing out like a sore thumb, but when the fight really gets going, it really gets going, with some of the coolest and most fluid animation of the entire tournament. What we actually get for Jay is some super compelling stuff and does exactly what I wanted it to do, that being driving a rift between Jay and Nya for the future of Dragons Rising. Jay's departure is rather unfortunate because it would have been really cool to see him do a bit more during the tournament, but Raz sending him away also makes complete sense as a ploy to try and get the ninja out of the tournament, and is another perfect case of the ninja putting stuff off time and time again to save the world, and it's also yet another case of Raz throwing people away as soon as they remind him of his weaker, young self. Evil Jay was really awesome to finally see, and he gets a really great role in the story of Dragons Rising Season 2, and I'm very excited to see where they take him and his story with Nya in the future, and speaking of, Nya continues to be a really great member of the ninja team here. She doesn't have all too much going on aside from the Jay and Kai stuff, but she still serves as a great supporting figure to not only the new ninja, but Lloyd as he's now leading the team, but more on him in a minute. Nya absolutely goes through it here. She's just lost Kai to the nether space and now has to deal with Jay's shattered goodness, and all of this is really well done throughout the tournament arc. Until she and Rayu get off-screen captured by Rox and Nox, which is very, very unfortunate. Having the Forbidden Five pick off the eliminated ninja and imprisoning them in the Monastery of Gates is a really sick idea on paper, but I think Zane and Cole should have gotten the same treatment, and I definitely don't think it should have been off-screen. Other than that, I don't have any particular issues with how Nya was handled here. Her character writing has been really consistent throughout Dragons Rising, and even though her getting sidelined after episode 17 is a big shame, it isn't too big of a deal. It doesn't have any negative consequences on her writing at all, so it isn't a massive deal, just a thing that I would have liked to see changed a bit. I am going to take this opportunity to briefly talk about Rayu though, because I'm going to be honest, I do not like him all too much, unfortunately. I liked him perfectly fine in Season 1, he was a cute little dragon and he had a really nice connection to Sora, and I do think he had some really solid moments in Season 2, like watching the Matriarch die, and he had some fun little animated bits while training, but on the whole I find that he just doesn't do all too much, and it's to the point where if he isn't on screen I tend to forget about his existence, so when he got kidnapped in episode 17 I just didn't notice his absence like at all. I hope they start doing a bit more with him in the future, because this issue also extends into the first half of Season 3, and it's very unfortunate because I do really want to like Rayu, but it's just very hard to do when he doesn't have anything too interesting going for his character plot-wise, and giving him the Dragon Ivory stuff is a decent start, but it doesn't do all too much for him when it's not really a major focus of the tournament, and his character doesn't grow in any way, so I don't really know what I'm supposed to feel towards this guy. I'm just a bit apathetic towards Rayu, unfortunately. A character who does have interesting stuff going for him though is Lloyd, and I absolutely adore what they did with him, not just in this part, but in this season as a whole. Lloyd throughout Dragons Rising has struggled a lot with coming to grips with leading the team and replacing Master Wu, and whereas part 1 focused on his anxiety stemming from Source Dragon visions and leading the team, this part leans all into him on being a master and a teacher, and it's absolutely fantastic. They really give us a full view on his strengths and weaknesses as a master, and I'm so glad they went for this holistic approach with his arc, because it gives us a far more nuanced view on him, not only as a master, but as a person, and it's very similar to what they've done with Egot and Raz this season. Lloyd has a lot of strengths as a master. He's kind, caring, gives solid advice, but as Rontu said, he's scared of not being able to protect everyone, but it means he'll try as hard as he can, making him a great master. And not only is he all of these things, he's been leading the team for a while now and has done a really good job for the most part, so it isn't like he has no experience whatsoever. One thing that I really appreciate about this arc is the fact that he doesn't have to earn his title, so to speak, because it's not one test that makes him a good master, but rather his defining traits and qualities as a person that make him suitable to lead the team. And it serves as a really great reminder to who Lloyd is as a character. Despite all of this, he does have faults and flaws as a master, and it doesn't start off as perfect for him. He puts stuff off for too long, leading him to be a bit neglectful of his team at times, and he isn't the best teacher, what with Sora only being able to achieve a primitive spinjitzu during the final game of the tournament, with his biggest problem as a master being the fact that he can't detach himself from Master Wu's teachings enough, and they absolutely set him up to move away from them at the end of the season, because he looks really disappointed and disillusioned with Wu once Arin and the 5 escape. The ending of his arc, at least for this season, has motion to remind him that despite everything, he did succeed with his mission despite losing one of his students and the Forbidden Five getting away. I'm really glad that they acknowledge that Lloyd did succeed at their ultimate goal of stopping Raz from getting to the Source Dragons, while also taking time to acknowledge his failures. It shows that he does still have room to grow, and while once again, yes we do know how this was handled in Season 3, It's still not over for this chapter, and it has some fantastic setup for his future in Dragons Rising, and I cannot praise it enough, especially when the Master Rock isn't all Lloyd has this part, because they also continue his anxiety story from part 1, and I love how they didn't completely put a stop to his visions after the Blood Moon. They do take a bit of a backseat compared to the first half of this season, but it makes sense with him having already overcome the more sudden and uncontrollable side of them. And when this part already does a great job of telling his master story, I really can't be upset about them not being as prevalent. The visions also got a bit of a story conclusion here, with Sora telling Lloyd that he can't lose faith in himself as a fighter and leader because of them, and that being what drives him to win the match against Beatrix, at least before she murks him, feels very conclusive in a good way for the more character-focused aspect of what these visions brought to him, and it really cements Dragons Rising Season 2 as the new peak for Lloyd's character, only being rivaled by maybe the Oni trilogy, but even then I still think Dragons Rising Season 2 kinda clears it. Lloyd's 2 arcs this season were absolutely fantastic, and I am amazed that they were handled as well as they were here. Arin has some of the best character work in the entire franchise, but this is absolutely a contender to be a runner-up for me, and it's always one of the first things that comes to mind when I think about what I love about this season. Lloyd is absolutely still my favourite ninja, and I just cannot praise what they did with him enough here. I adore it to bits. And with Lloyd being talked about, I think that's pretty much everything there is to say about this season. All in all, Dragons Rising Season 2 has 2 fantastic parts, with a brilliant and near perfect first half, and while the second half does definitely have a lot more issues and is rather flawed in some areas, I think it absolutely has higher highs than part 1 does, and it cements itself as not only the best season of the franchise for me, but I think one of my favourite pieces of media of all time. Thinking about this part and season as a whole, and talking about it is just always an absolute joy, and it truly is a new peak for this decade-old franchise. I adore Dragons Rising Season 2, and the Tournament of Sorcerers is, despite its flaws, a fantastic continuation to part 1's fantastic story. Thank you all so much for watching. If you do want to discuss the Ninjago show with other fans, feel free to join my Discord server. There's a link on screen now, and there should be a link in the description of this video. Also, if you did enjoy this video, please do consider subscribing. We're pretty close to 1,000 subscribers, and it would mean a lot if you did subscribe. It's free, and you can always change your mind later if you don't want to be anymore. Thank you all again so much, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye for now. I think we can all agree that the real best part of the season, though, is the smirking Raz gif, baby! Yeah! We love the smirking Raz gif!
You feel tight, look at yourself. Inside your heart, you are